Did you ever wonder what it was like to grow old, when the world was a tangle of castles and crusades, when life expectancy hovered closer to 30 than 80, and disease was a constant shadow? Did people fear getting old then, just as we do now? Did they celebrate it or dread it? For hundreds of years, from the Dark Ages to the dawning of the Renaissance, people thought about the journey of life, its twists and turns, and the inevitable arrival of gray hairs and slower steps. Number 9. The old crow knows where the corn is hidden. This ancient saying, echoing through the cobbled streets and quiet fields of medieval Europe, spoke volumes about a particular kind of wisdom. It was not the wisdom of books, though those were treasured by the few who could read them. It was not the wisdom of spiritual insight, though that was revered by all. No, the old crow knows where the corn is hidden was about the wisdom of survival, of cunning, of knowing the lay of the land and the secrets of the harvest. In a time when life was often harsh and unforgiving, this practical knowledge was golden. It suggested that a person who had lived many seasons, seen many droughts and many bountiful harvests, possessed an understanding that youth simply could not yet grasp. Think about a medieval village. It was a place where generations often lived side by side, sharing the same small cottages, working the same plots of land. An elderly farmer, perhaps a woman with gnarled hands and a back bent from years of toil, might not have the strength of a young man, but her mind held maps of experience. She knew which corner of the field received the most sunlight after a late spring frost, or where the water would pool during a heavy summer rain. She knew the signs of an early winter by the flight of the birds, or the best time to plant a certain crop based on patterns only visible after decades of observation. Her knowledge was not written down. It was carried in her memory, passed down in stories and demonstrations. She was the old crow who remembered the hidden places, the tricks of the trade, the solutions to problems that had stumped younger generations before they even existed. The idea of the old crow also connected to the natural world, which was deeply intertwined with medieval life. Animals were observed closely, their behaviors often providing lessons or warnings. Crows, with their keen intelligence and long lifespans, were seen as shrewd creatures. They remembered where food was stashed, where danger lurked, and they often communicated these insights within their flocks. So comparing an elder to an old crow was a compliment suggesting an acute awareness of the world's practicalities and dangers. It was a recognition that while physical strength might fade, a sharpened mind and a wealth of lived experience provided a different, equally vital power. This proverb might have been whispered around a crackling hearth on a cold winter night, perhaps after a young man complained about a failed crop or a lost animal. An elder might simply nod a knowing look in their eyes and then offer a piece of advice based on something that happened way back when. Such advice was rarely questioned, for the wisdom of the old crow had been proven time and again. It was a wisdom born not from abstract thought, but from the very dirt and struggle of existence. A young apprentice might learn from a master craftsman not just how to carve wood or hammer metal, but also how to source the best materials, how to manage difficult clients, or how to endure long hours of repetitive work. This master, perhaps with a long white beard and calloused hands, was the old crow of his trade. His knowledge of shortcuts and hidden efficiencies invaluable. The Anglo-Saxon poem, The Seafarer, though not directly using this proverb, evokes a similar sense of lived experience and hardship, leading to a unique kind of wisdom. The old sailor recounts his journeys, the storms endured, the isolation faced, and through these narratives, a profound understanding of life's fleeting nature emerges, a perspective only attainable through vast and challenging experience. While it speaks more to spiritual revelation, The underlying value of life lessons acquired over time resonates with the old crow idea. The wisdom is not just about finding corn, but about knowing the deeper currents of the world. Even in religious texts and sermons, the elder often played the role of the seasoned guide. A venerable abbot, with decades spent in prayer and administration, knew the hidden trials of the monastic life, the subtle temptations and the pathways to spiritual peace, much like the old crow who knew the safest routes through a dangerous forest. Number 8. An old man's counsel is cold comfort. This proverb might sound a bit harsh to modern ears, but it captures a complex truth about how advice from the aged was sometimes received in the medieval world. It was not always about disrespect for elders. Instead, it spoke to the practical realities of life, the often unbridgeable gap between the wisdom of experience and the urgency of youth, or the sometimes grim outlook that a long life could bring. Cold comfort means a small or unwelcome amount of comfort, something that does not truly alleviate the pain or solve the problem. When advice from an old man was seen as cold comfort, it often implied that the advice, while perhaps wise and well-intended, was impractical, out of touch, or simply too late to truly help. Think of a young knight, eager for glory, preparing for his first battle. An old, battle-scarred veteran, perhaps missing an eye or limping from an old wound, might offer counsel. He could describe the horrors of combat, the agonizing pain of a sword wound, the fear, the chaos, the low chance of survival. He might tell the young knight to avoid certain risks, to prioritize survival over glory, to never trust a fleeing foe. This advice, though absolutely true and drawn from painful experience, might be cold comfort to the eager youth. It did not fuel his courage or provide an easy path to victory. Instead, it presented a grim reality, a stark picture of what lay ahead, potentially dampening his spirit without offering a clear, actionable alternative that matched his youthful ambition. The old man's words were heavy with the weight of countless past losses, a burden the young man was not yet ready to bear. In a practical sense, the cold comfort could also refer to advice that was no longer relevant. Agricultural practices, while slow to change, did evolve. Feudal obligations shifted. Political landscapes, though seemingly stagnant, could undergo dramatic upheavals. An old peasant might advise a young farmer to plant certain seeds based on generations-old traditions, but a new pest or a change in weather patterns could render that advice obsolete. The wisdom was still there, but its application had withered. The counsel was rooted in a world that no longer entirely existed, and thus its warmth had gone out of it. This proverb also touched upon the sometimes pessimistic or fatalistic view that could come with age. Having witnessed countless cycles of birth and death, triumph and failure, prosperity and famine, an old person might have developed a cynical perspective on human endeavors. Their advice might be laced with a sense of inevitability, a belief that certain outcomes were simply ordained and that struggle was often futile. While this perspective might be accurate from their accumulated experience, it could feel like cold comfort to someone still full of hope, ambition, and the belief that effort could change destiny. The advice might be sound, but its delivery lacked the inspiring spark that youth often craved. It was like being told, "It's all going to end badly, but here's how to make it slightly less bad." References to the wisdom of elders can be found throughout medieval literature, but there are also hints of the difficulty of imparting that wisdom. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the old characters often have a weary, world-worn view that contrasts sharply with the youthful exuberance of others. The Reeve, an old and irritable manor official, tells a tale of cunning and revenge, reflecting a bitter wisdom gained from years of managing difficult people. His advice, if offered, would surely be steeped in suspicion and self-interest, perhaps offering cold comfort to anyone seeking pure justice. John of Salisbury, in his Police Graticus from the 12th century, explored the nature of governance and the role of the elder statesman. While emphasizing the importance of mature counsel, he also understood the impetuous nature of younger rulers, who often preferred their own judgments to the slow, cautious wisdom of their elders, especially if that wisdom meant curbing their desires or delaying gratification. The old man's counsel, while potentially life-saving, rarely felt good in the moment. Number 7. To die young is a pity. To live old is a burden. This proverb captures a profound paradox that was keenly felt in the medieval period, a time of stark realities and often short, brutal lives. It reflects a sentiment that life itself was a complex blessing, and that while an early death was certainly regrettable, a prolonged existence could bring its own severe difficulties. It was not a dismissal of life's value, but rather an acknowledgement of the harsh conditions that could make old age a trial. Consider the reality of medieval medicine, or the lack thereof. There were no antibiotics, no complex surgeries, no palliative care in the modern sense. An old body was often a body ravaged by years of hard labor, recurrent illness, and poor nutrition. Arthritis, chronic pain, failing eyesight, and tooth decay were common and often debilitating. A person who lived into their 60s or 70s might have spent decades suffering from ailments that would now be easily treated. Their physical capabilities would diminish significantly, making it difficult to participate in the manual labor that was the backbone of society. For a peasant, this could mean losing the ability to work their land, making them dependent on their children or the charity of the community. In a subsistence economy, this dependency was a serious concern, not just for the individual, but for their family. The old body became a source of increasing discomfort and limitation, turning life into a daily struggle. Beyond physical decline, the medieval world also presented social burdens for the aged. While some elders were revered for their wisdom, as discussed with the old crow proverb, others might find themselves marginalized. If they lost their economic usefulness, their status could diminish. Famines, wars, and plagues often hit the elderly hardest, as their immune systems were weaker and their mobility restricted. Many accounts from historical chronicles speak of populations decimated by disease, with the old and the very young being the most vulnerable. The sheer survival of many years implied enduring countless hardships, witnessing the death of loved ones, and experiencing repeated cycles of suffering. Living to an old age meant carrying the weight of profound loss and an often bleak understanding of human mortality. This proverb also touches upon the psychological and spiritual challenges of old age. For some, the prolonged wait for death could be a source of anxiety, especially in a deeply religious society where the state of one's soul at the moment of passing was of paramount importance. The prospect of a long period of infirmity, potentially leading to a painful or undignified death, was a fear. The burden was not just physical or economic, but also the mental and spiritual endurance required to face the twilight years, knowing that each day brought one closer to the inevitable. The desire for a quick, good death, often associated with dying in one's bed, surrounded by family and having received the last rites, was a common wish, contrasting with the protracted suffering that could accompany a truly long life. Literary examples often showed old characters suffering greatly. In the epic poem Beowulf, the titular hero, though mighty, faces his final, most dangerous challenge as an old man ultimately dying from his wounds. His age, while not explicitly a burden in the sense of infirmity, represents a final weary stage of his life, where heroic deeds are no longer effortless. The Anglo-Saxon riddles, though playful, sometimes describe the aging body in terms of its decay and the loss of its former functions. While not overtly pessimistic, they acknowledge the transformation that comes with time. The writings of St. Augustine of Hippo, though predating the full medieval period, influenced much medieval thought. He pondered the nature of time and the human condition, often reflecting on the brevity of life and the suffering that could accompany its later stages, sometimes seeing it as a preparatory period for the afterlife, but acknowledging its inherent difficulties. For the common person, the burden was more immediate: the aching joints, the empty larder, the chill of winter without sufficient fuel, the constant fear of being unable to contribute and thus becoming a drain on others. Number 6. When the teeth fail, the tongue speaks sour. This stark medieval proverb captures a common observation about the physical and emotional challenges of aging, particularly in a time without modern dentistry or comfortable living conditions. It connects the physical decline of the body, specifically the loss of teeth, a very visible and affable sign of aging with a change in temperament, suggesting that physical discomfort and reduced capabilities and lead to bitterness, irritability, or a generally unpleasant disposition. The sour tongue implies harsh words, complaints, and a generally ungracious attitude. Consider the daily life of a medieval person. Food was often coarse, hard, and poorly prepared. Chewing was a serious business. Losing teeth, which was an almost universal part of aging, made eating difficult and painful. Without proper nutrition, health would further decline, leading to more weakness and discomfort. Imagine the constant ache of gums where teeth once were, the inability to properly chew bread, or the struggle to consume tougher meats. This daily, persistent physical discomfort would naturally fray the nerves and make a person less patient and more prone to anger or complaint. The physical reality of a mouth full of missing or rotting teeth was a direct pathway to a sour tongue, not just literally from the limited diet, but metaphorically from the frustration and pain. Beyond the purely physical, the loss of teeth also symbolized a broader decline in a person's ability to participate fully in life. It signaled a loss of independence and perhaps a perceived loss of dignity. Someone who could no longer eat certain foods might feel isolated at shared meals. Someone who struggled to speak clearly due to missing teeth might become self-conscious and withdrawn, or conversely lash out in frustration. In a communal society, where much interaction happened over shared meals and verbal storytelling, such physical changes could have a significant social impact. The sour tongue could also stem from a feeling of helplessness, a recognition that the body was betraying them, or from the general resentment of being old and frail in a world that often valued strength and youth. This proverb also hints at the lack of understanding or empathy for the struggles of the aged. Instead of seeing the sour tongue as a symptom of pain or hardship, it might have been perceived as an inherent character flaw, a natural consequence of growing old. This simplified view could lead to further isolation for the elderly, as younger generations might shy away from their grumpy elders, reinforcing the negative cycle. The old person, feeling increasingly isolated and uncomfortable, might indeed become more bitter. It was a vicious cycle where physical decay led to emotional decay, which in turn could lead to social ostracism. In medieval literature, while direct mentions of sour tongues from tooth loss might be rare, the depiction of elderly characters often includes physical decrepitude alongside a sometimes cynical or critical outlook. The wife of Bath in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, though not explicitly described as having a sour tongue due to dental issues, is an old woman with a strong, opinionated, and sometimes harsh voice. Her experiences have made her worldly and unafraid to speak her mind, often critically of men and institutions. While her sourness is more about her personality, shaped by life experience, it resonates with the idea that age can bring a less sugar-coated way of speaking. The medieval dance of death imagery, common in art and literature, graphically depicted people of all ages, including the old, often showing their physical decay, reminding everyone of mortality. The old were not spared from suffering, and their outward physical signs of decay were often linked to a corresponding inner or outward change in demeanor. A scholar like Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar from the 13th century, while focusing on science, also explored the effects of the body on the mind and health, hinting at the connection between physical state and mental well-being, even if he didn't directly use this proverb. Number 5. Every day a thread until the garment of life is spun. This proverb paints a beautiful and poignant picture of life's relentless progression towards its end. It likens each day lived to a single thread, added to a growing tapestry or a piece of cloth. The garment of life is the whole of a person's existence, slowly but surely being woven, stitch by stitch, day by day, until it is complete. Once the garment is fully spun, the weaving stops, symbolizing the end of life. This imagery speaks to the inevitability of aging and death, but also to the cumulative nature of a life lived where every single moment contributes to the whole. In the medieval worldview, where life was often short and unpredictable, the idea of a predetermined span or a gradual unfolding was both a comfort and a stark reality. The metaphor of spinning and weaving was deeply resonant, as these were fundamental crafts in every household. Women spent countless hours at the spinning wheel, turning raw wool or flax into thread, and then at the loom, painstakingly weaving those threads into cloth for clothing, blankets, and tapestries. Everyone understood the labor, the patience, and the skill involved in creating a finished garment. Thus, every day a thread immediately conjured images of steady, continuous effort leading towards a finished product. It emphasized that life was not a sudden burst, but a gradual accumulation, a slow building up of experience and time. The proverb implies that each day is valuable, a unique contribution to the whole. It is not just about the passage of time, but about the substance added during that time. Just as a single thread, no matter how fine, is essential to the strength and beauty of the whole fabric, so too is each day, each experience, each interaction. The garment of life is a unique creation for every individual, shaped by their choices, their joys, their sorrows, and their labors. As one grew older, the garment grew larger, its pattern more intricate, its colors deeper. The completion of the garment meant that the design was finished, the work was done. This saying also carried a sense of acceptance concerning mortality. There was no escaping the final stitch. The weaving would cease when the thread ran out, or when the weaver decided the garment was complete. For medieval people, death was a constant presence, whether through disease, famine, or violence. They understood that life was finite, and this proverb provided a gentle, almost poetic way of expressing that truth. It was a reminder to live each day to add that thread to contribute to the unique garment one was creating, knowing that the spool would eventually run empty. It was less about dreading the end and more about acknowledging the ongoing process. Medieval literature and art often used similar metaphors of life as a journey or a progression. The Wheel of Fortune, a popular motif, depicted the unpredictable ups and downs of human existence, with individuals being carried up to power and then cast down. While it speaks to fate, it also implies a continuous movement through different stages of life. The allegorical poem Piers Plowman by William Langland, a masterpiece of the 14th century, describes a spiritual journey through various life stages and social conditions, illustrating the slow, arduous process of seeking truth and salvation, much like the slow spinning of a thread towards a greater purpose. Books of hours, popular prayer books, often contained calendars that marked the passage of days and seasons, emphasizing the cyclical nature of time and the human experience within it. The image of the Moirae, or fates in classical mythology, who spun the thread of human life, measured its length and then cut it, also had echoes in medieval thought connecting the concept of life as a thread to ancient wisdom. Every sunrise meant another thread, adding to the ever-growing, ever-changing pattern of one's existence, until the final, inevitable moment when the loom stood silent. Number 4. Youth for folly, age for wisdom. This timeless proverb articulates a fundamental belief held throughout the medieval period, that the early years of life are often characterized by impulsiveness, mistakes, and inexperience, while maturity and old age bring with them a greater capacity for judgment, reason, and profound understanding. It reflects a societal expectation that wisdom was not something one was born with, but something accumulated through the trials and triumphs of a long life. Youth for folly suggests that young people, full of vigor and untested by the world's harsh realities, were prone to foolish decisions. They might act on impulse, be easily swayed by desires, or lack the foresight to anticipate the consequences of their actions. In a society where apprenticeships began young and many married and started families early, the potential for youthful missteps was ever present. A young knight might rush into battle without proper strategy, risking his life and the lives of his companions. A young merchant might make rash investments, losing his family's livelihood. A young peasant might neglect his duties, leading to a poor harvest. These follies were seen not necessarily as moral failings, but as natural consequences of a lack of experience, a lack of the sober reflection that only years could bring. They were part of the learning process, albeit often a painful one. Age for wisdom, in contrast, highlights the revered role of elders in medieval society. As individuals navigated decades of life, they encountered a vast array of situations, solved countless problems, and witnessed the outcomes of myriad choices, both their own and those of others. This accumulated experience became a rich storehouse of knowledge and insight. An old man or woman, having seen many seasons of joy and sorrow, famine and feast, peace and conflict, was expected to possess a depth of understanding that young people simply could not. Their wisdom was practical, born of observation and survival. They had learned from their own follies and could now offer guidance to prevent others from making the same mistakes. They knew what truly mattered in the long run. This proverb underpinned the social hierarchy where elders often held positions of respect and authority. Whether as village heads, respected craftsmen, or venerated spiritual leaders, their counsel was sought in disputes, their knowledge was essential for successful harvests, and their stories preserved the history and traditions of the community. Their slower pace and more deliberate decision-making were often seen as virtues, a stark contrast to the quick, often thoughtless actions of the young. The wisdom of age was not just about knowing facts, but about understanding the complexities of human nature, the subtle currents of community dynamics, and the deep rhythms of the natural world. Many medieval texts and figures championed the wisdom of age. Boethius, whose Consolation of Philosophy was widely read, though written earlier, profoundly influenced medieval thought with its emphasis on reason and understanding transcending worldly misfortunes, a wisdom often achieved through adversity and mature reflection. The Church Fathers, whose writings were foundational, often presented themselves as venerable figures whose teachings were the distillation of centuries of theological debate and spiritual experience, emphasizing the wisdom of accumulated tradition. In medieval romances, while young heroes performed daring feats, it was often the wise old hermit or the experienced king who provided crucial advice, prophecy, or the final insight needed for success. King Arthur, in some legends, seeks the counsel of Merlin, an ancient and powerful wizard, whose wisdom far surpasses the king's youthful energy. This dynamic reinforces the idea that raw power or youthful enthusiasm alone were insufficient. They needed to be guided by the seasoned hand of age and wisdom. The very structure of institutions, from monastic orders to feudal courts, often placed older, more experienced individuals in leadership roles, recognizing that the long view, the patient approach, and the seasoned judgment were invaluable assets for stability. Number 3. Gray hairs are wisdom's crown. This proverb offers a profoundly positive and reverent view of aging, directly linking the physical signs of growing old, specifically gray or white hair, with the accumulation of wisdom and honor. It suggests that gray hair is not merely a sign of physical decline, but rather a symbol of dignity, experience, and the deep knowledge acquired over a long life. The word crown elevates gray hairs to a regal status, indicating that the wisdom they represent is a mark of true nobility and authority. In medieval society, where formal education was rare and literacy was limited, lived experience was the primary teacher. Therefore, a person who had survived many years, witnessed countless events, and weathered numerous storms was considered a living library of knowledge. Gray hair became an outward sign of this internal wealth. It signified not only a long life, but also a life that had likely endured hardships, overcome challenges, and thus gathered invaluable insights. An elder with gray hair was seen as someone who had completed many cycles of the seasons, who understood the patterns of nature, the complexities of human relationships, and the subtle nuances of faith and morality. This knowledge was something to be respected and sought after. The crown aspect further emphasizes the idea of authority and respect. A crown is worn by royalty, signifying leadership, power, and a special status. By comparing gray hairs to a crown, the proverb bestows upon the elderly a similar kind of inherent authority and prestige. This was not an authority derived from physical strength or inherited title alone, but from the sheer weight of years and the wisdom they brought. People would often turn to elders in their community for advice on everything from farming and trade to family disputes and spiritual guidance. A village elder, perhaps an old woman who had delivered countless babies, or a former soldier who had seen the world, would have commanded respect simply by virtue of their age and the visible symbol of their accumulated life. Religious traditions also reinforced this reverence for age. In Christian iconography and texts, venerable figures like apostles, saints, and prophets were often depicted with long, flowing white beards and hair symbolizing their profound spiritual wisdom and closeness to divine truth. The biblical proverb from the book of Proverbs, "Gray hair is a crown of splendor. It is attained in the way of righteousness," directly echoes this sentiment and would have been well known and influential in medieval Christian thought. This sacred association further elevated the status of gray hairs as a sign of divine favor or a life lived in accordance with righteous principles. References to the wisdom of age and the reverence for elders appear across medieval literature. In Geoffrey Chaucer's The Physician's Tale, the virtuous Virginius is described with a character that evokes respect and age, and his wisdom is implicitly acknowledged. The numerous monastic chronicles and hagiographies often depict abbots and abbesses or hermit saints as deeply wise figures whose advanced age lends gravitas to their spiritual authority and counsel. Their gray hairs were visual markers of their long years of devotion and study. The Icelandic sagas, though from an earlier period, also contain numerous examples of wise old chieftains and counselors, whose authority is based on their long experience and shrewd judgment. Even when physical prowess declined, the respect for their intellectual and moral authority often remained, reinforced by the visual symbol of their gray hair, a silent testimony to a life well lived and knowledge hard won. It was a tangible emblem that declared to the world, "Here stands a person of profound understanding." Number 2. Old age is a ship without rudder. This powerful proverb captures a profound sense of vulnerability and lack of control that could accompany old age in the medieval world. A ship without a rudder is adrift, tossed by the currents and winds, unable to steer its own course or reach a desired destination. This metaphor vividly illustrates the feeling of being at the mercy of forces beyond one's command, a sensation often felt by the elderly as their physical and mental faculties began to wane. In a society with limited support systems for the aged, especially for those without strong family networks, losing one's rudder meant facing serious hardship. A medieval person, as they aged, would gradually lose their physical strength, eyesight, hearing, and agility. These were not minor inconveniences. They directly impacted one's ability to perform labor, earn a living, or even navigate the world safely. A peasant who could no longer work their field was dependent on others. A craftsman whose hands trembled could no longer ply their trade. Without the capacity to steer their own economic or physical course, they became like a rudderless ship, dependent on the benevolence of others to guide them. This dependency could lead to feelings of helplessness, fear, and a loss of personal autonomy. The metaphor also speaks to a loss of mental sharpness or memory. Forgetting names, places, or important tasks could be disorienting and frightening, making daily life a challenge. A mind that once guided and planned now felt subject to unpredictable currents, its memories fading like landmarks disappearing over the horizon. This mental drifting was perhaps even more terrifying than physical decline, as it affected the very essence of self and control. The world once navigated with certainty became a confusing expanse, and the old person, like the ship, had no clear way to find their way. Furthermore, a ship without rudder implies a loss of direction, not just physically or mentally, but also socially and existentially. As friends and family members died, an old person might find themselves increasingly isolated, losing their anchors to the past and their connections to the present. Their purpose in life, once tied to raising a family or contributing to their community, might become less clear as their abilities diminished. They were no longer actively steering the ship of their life, but merely being carried along by the currents of time and circumstance, often towards an unknown and perhaps dreaded shore. The inability to choose one's own path, to make decisive movements, was a deep source of anxiety. While there are many medieval texts that celebrate the wisdom of age, there are also those that portray its valbridius. The everyman morality play, popular in the late medieval period, depicts a character facing death and the abandonment by his worldly possessions and companions, highlighting the ultimate aloneness and lack of control. One faces at life's end a state perhaps exacerbated by the infirmities of old age. Though not directly using the rudder metaphor, the play explores themes of inevitability and helplessness in the face of destiny. In some medieval medical treatises, such as those influenced by Galenic humoral theory, old age was often described as a cold and dry state, a natural decline leading to a loss of vitality and function, making one more susceptible to illness and less capable of self-governance. The physical body itself became a rudderless vessel, its humors out of balance, its strength dissipated. This scientific understanding, rudimentary as it was, reinforced the perception of age as a period of profound physical and existential vulnerability. The ship metaphor encapsulates this perfectly. A journey forced upon one without the means to steer. Number 1. An old dog learns no new tricks. This widespread proverb, still common today, has deep roots in the medieval period and speaks to a persistent belief about the difficulty of changing ingrained habits and acquiring new knowledge in old age. It was an observation about human nature, suggesting that as a person grows older, their ways become set, their minds less flexible, and their willingness to adapt diminishes. The image of the old dog is key. Dogs were working animals in the medieval world, used for hunting, herding, and guarding. Training them required patience, repetition, and starting when they were young. An old dog, having spent its life performing certain tasks in a certain way, would be resistant to learning entirely new commands or behaviors. Its habits were too deeply ingrained, its energy perhaps too low, its attention less keen. This observation about animals was then applied to humans. In the medieval context, this proverb often related to practical skills and traditional ways of life. If a peasant had farmed the same way for 60 years, using the same tools and methods, they would likely be unwilling or unable to adopt new agricultural innovations. Even if they promised better yields, their hands and minds were accustomed to the old ways. Similarly, a craftsman who had perfected his trade over decades would find it challenging to learn a completely new one, or to adopt drastically different techniques even if they were more efficient. The proverb was a subtle critique of rigidity, acknowledging that while age brought wisdom, it could also bring a stubborn adherence to the familiar. This inability to learn new tricks also extended to intellectual and social spheres. In a world of slow change, sticking to tradition was often valued, but at times, adaptability was necessary. An old lord might cling to outdated feudal customs, struggling to adapt to evolving political landscapes or new forms of warfare. An old monk might resist new interpretations of scripture or changes in monastic discipline, preferring the stability of what he had always known. The proverb suggested that the mind, like the body, became less pliable with age. New ideas might be met with skepticism, new customs with resistance, simply because they were unfamiliar and required mental effort to integrate. It was not necessarily a judgment of intelligence, but of openness and adaptability. While wisdom was celebrated, as seen in "Gray hairs are wisdom's crown," this proverb offers a counterpoint, highlighting that wisdom could sometimes come at the cost of flexibility. The knowledge gained from long experience could become a barrier to new learning, a fortress built against innovation. It was a lament, not for physical decline, but for a mental hardening, a shutting down of curiosity and openness to change. This proverb was likely used in moments of frustration when younger generations tried to introduce new methods or ideas, only to be met with the unwavering traditionalism of their elders. While not directly quoting this proverb, many medieval texts indirectly touch upon the resistance to change. Sir Thomas Malory's The Morte d'Arthur, a compilation of Arthurian legends from the 15th century, shows how the established order and the old ways of chivalry struggle to adapt to new challenges, ultimately leading to the downfall of the Round Table. The old knights, while honorable, are often too set in their ways to overcome their internal divisions or embrace new strategies. Even the development of new technologies, like the longbow in warfare or the printing press later in the period, would have met resistance from those accustomed to the old ways, those who found it difficult to learn new tricks. The old guard, steeped in tradition, often saw change as a threat to the established order, an affront to the wisdom they had painstakingly acquired through their long lives.